Assalamualaikum, teacher.
Waalaikumsalam.
Okay, today me and Shafira is going to interview you based on your classroom and lesson. So my first question is that are the types of question that you use depend on stages of your lesson, such as set induction, pre, while, and post?
Actually, yes, to a certain extent. In the beginning of the lesson, I did ask a few referential questions to grab my students' attention. I've also asked referential questions so that they would be interested towards the lesson in which they could make connections related to the topic. Not only that, I am also the type of teacher who likes to provide different materials which fits different stages that I am teaching, especially if I am doing a non-textbook based lesson plan where I need to produce my own materials. So this type of questions I ask are also highly dependent on the type of material that I am using in that current stage as well as the objective of that lesson stage.
Okay, it's very clear. Okay, my next question is that from our analysis, we found that you tend to use yes and no question a lot. What is your purpose of asking this type of questions?
Well, I tend to ask this type of questions as a form of monitoring the classroom whenever I want to have feedback on how my students are doing so far, or whenever they are ready to proceed with the lesson, or even if they have any questions and if they are following along with the pace of the lesson or not. So I would use yes and no question as a quick way for me to know if they are doing well with the lesson or not.
Okay, thank you. My third question is that we noticed that when you ask yes and no question, you don't really wait for responses. Why is that?
Well, it is mostly a repetition or just something that I would ask to set the tone of the class. So I don't really need responses. Sometimes when I ask questions like, there are paragraphs right, it's just to repeat information that I want them to notice or just to loosen the tone of the lesson and to not make it sound too strict.
Okay, and my fourth question is that what is the purpose of you using a referential question and why is it less frequent in your lesson?
Well, I had asked referential questions at the beginning of the lesson to know how my students are feeling, which starts the lesson with small conversations and gain their attention before we dive into the topic that we'll be learning. I also use referential questions when I want authentic answers from my students, such as to relate with their experiences or their opinions. I also use referential questions at the beginning of my lesson because I want to grab their interest towards the topic that we are learning. But I tend to use it less frequently as the lesson progresses because I am more focused on discussing the answers for the materials. The activities are more complex as we proceed because they are practiced in one lesson and applying what they have learned in post lesson.
Okay, thank you. I believe Fira have a few more questions. Go ahead, Fira.
Okay, so is there a purpose of you using open-ended and closed questions?
Yes, of course. I would use open-ended questions to give opportunities for my students to answer the questions in many ways. I also use open-ended questions because I want them to extend and elaborate their responses. I use closed-ended questions is when I want my students to notice certain information or detail and point it out verbally. For instance, when I give my students the materials or task sheet, I ask them questions regarding of the task sheet to make my instructions clearer so they can understand better what I want them to do. Not only that, it is also a way for me to help direct students towards the correct answer.
Okay, so what about display questions? Why do you use this type of questions in your lesson?
Well, it's because I want to see their comprehension based on the material which I have provided them. So questions like, what is your answer for question number 5 helps me know whether they have understood or not. I know the answer, but I want to test their understanding based on the reading text.
Okay, so for the last question, from your macro teaching lesson, Which question do you think is able to gather the most responses from the students?
First of all, in my opinion, there are two ways which I would find most responses. The first one being is the number of students responding to the question. So this will probably be yes, no, and cross-ended questions, because I would usually get like more than one student giving me response, because it is just yes, no, and cross-ended question. The second way to define the most responses is by the complexity, length, as well as the various answers given by the student. For example, when I ask, why do you think it's important for us to eat healthy? Students tend to give me much more longer or complex responses, such as, so that we don't get sick, teacher. So it's not just yes or no answer or one correct answer only.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers, and thank you very much for spending the time to answer our questions.
Alright.
Yes, that is all from us. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.